introduce our guest. His name is Dr. John West. He's Vice President and Senior Fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle. He serves as Managing Director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture. And by the way, he co-founded that institute, that center, with philosopher of science Stephen Meyer, who we love, way back in 1996. His current research examines the impact of science and scientism on public policy and culture. His other areas of expertise include constitutional law, American government and institutions, and religion and politics. John West holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and was previously an associate professor of political science at Seattle Pacific University, which is a university that we're going to talk about some in this podcast. And at that university, he chaired the Department of Political Science and Geography, and he has directed a dozen documentaries. He's written or edited some 13 books, including the book we're going to be talking about today, his most recent book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, and the subtitle's important: Why America's Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. The Synoptic Gospels, and we've been talking about this for years on the Bible Answer broadcast, I mean, they provide complementary details. And you cited an example of that, and I think Michael should most certainly know that. Your second chapter is titled Secularist Science, and I found this to be a very important chapter. In fact, you cite Francis Collins as the quintessential example of a Stockholm Syndrome Christian who diminishes the role of God in creation. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, and this was now sort of post-COVID controversies. Collins is less a star, a little more controversial, but I will say that when we at Discovery Institute began interacting with him or following him, it was like any criticism was regarded as verboten. And I experienced this actually some of myself where, but the issue is it's not his personality. And just to be clear, I'm not questioning his personal attachment to Jesus. And he has an inspiring, story of how he was an atheist, agnostic, and then came to Christ. But again, he's a public figure, and he has public teachings and also public actions in government, which we can get to. And I think those are things to fair game. And like Mike Licona, I think Francis Collins, in the area of God as creator, tried to get his way by discouraging debate and by deplatforming, if you will, people who disagreed with him. So Collins promotes this view of theistic, or I would say deistic evolution, where he tries to baptize Darwin, and not just Darwin as common ancestry, which I think is problematic too, but even more generally, if you read his book, The Language of God, which was a bestseller, and loads of Christians, and I think loads of Christian pastors who should have known better, I think some of them didn't actually read the book, praised. He basically argues that either God didn't direct specifically, and he uses the example of junk DNA, which many of your listeners may now know has now been exploded scientifically. I mean, it's not good science, but at the time, this was the idea that most of our DNA doesn't code for proteins, and if it doesn't code for proteins, it's of no use to Darwinian evolution to build new things to that those chance mutations, and so it must be junk. And the argument was by Collins, well, God wouldn't have done, if God did that, he wouldn't have loaded our system with junk DNA. That would have been a lousy creator. So it must have been through this, process of Darwinian evolution, because that's a messy process and we could expect lots of junk and happenstance. That was part of his argument in this book. Now, he had one other alternative. So you either believe that the history of life was, done by Darwinian evolution, because it was and involved in a way happenstance and things because of the random mutations, because we're filled with junk DNA. Or he said, well, maybe you could believe, if you're a Christian, he doesn't say he did, but he said, you could believe that maybe God did actually direct things, maybe didn't just leave it to the unguided process of evolution. Maybe God did direct things, but then he made life look like it was the product of a blind and purposeless process. So your two options are either our development really was in some sense a Darwinian process that really didn't have us in view, or that maybe God did know from eternity and did direct, but he made it look like it was blind and undirected. And I have to say, this is a real mind bender. Some of your listeners will know Richard Dawkins, the arch atheist Darwinist. Even he started one of his books saying biology is the study of things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, he goes on to say, well, through science and stuff, we know that the real truth is that it wasn't. But he actually does say that when you look at biology, it looks designed, for a purpose. But here you have the leading evangelical Christian scientist toasted on the cover of Time magazine saying, oh, no. God made it look like it was random and directed. But we know through the subjective eyes of faith that maybe God directed it, but he made it look random and undirected. This is really screwy. And it's not based on evidence. I mean, that's the other thing. If you actually, and I do this a little bit in my book, and certain my colleagues have done it even more, but this is not driven by evidence, because the evidence doesn't show this. This is driven by a desire to be accepted. And also, in some degree, I think, that Collins, as a Stockholm Syndrome Christian, has bought into the surrounding secularist mindset, and so didn't want to delve too deeply into the evidence on the other side, because the evidence that he offers, like criticizing Michael Behe on irreducible complexity and stuff, he offers rehashed arguments that don't actually pan out. But here's why this matters. It's not just his view. He went on a crusade to spread this view to other Christian leaders, and then by default to all evangelical Christians. So I write about in the book that there's this actually meeting at the Bush #2 White House between him, speechwriter Michael Gerson, and a guy named Pete Wenner, who were commiserating about, they were embarrassed that so many Christians still were critical of Darwin. And so how do they surmount that embarrassment? Well, they have to convince them of the truth of Darwinian evolution. And so what did Collins do? He got millions of dollars from the Templeton Foundation to basically start a project specifically designed to convince evangelical Christian leaders to embrace Darwin. And he did it in the name of dialogue. Okay, that's fine to have dialogue, but he actually didn't want dialogue. What he did was hold these private confabs that would bring, say, leaders from Christianity Today, Reformed Theological Seminary, I mean, you name it, leading evangelicals, to privately only hear from people who are going to defend Darwinian evolution. They wouldn't bring anyone on the other side. They wouldn't bring Steve Meyer or Michael Behe or Bill Dembski or any of the number of other Christian thinkers who had critiques of Darwin. And the message of these meetings was, science overwhelmingly baptizes Darwin, therefore your only goal as theologians is to baptize that and figure a way to make it work. No one asked, the first question was, well, is Darwinism actually true or not? And Collins has spent a lifetime, some people saw this during COVID, but this was even in the debate over design and Darwin, it was similar. Collins tried to win the debate by preventing a debate. His message was, basically, anyone who disagreed with him was equivalent of a flat earther. And so just listen to me and my, handpicked proponents of deistic evolution and get them to buy off on that without listening to anyone on the other side, and he would go, and Christian group after Christian group enabled this. I write about how the official group of all the Protestant Christian colleges, the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities, invited him to lecture people on theistic evolution, and invited them to lecture college leaders, but did not invite anyone on the other side. And this happened with group after group, that basically, because they were so smitten, oh, he was on the cover of Time magazine, so it wasn't just Collins, like with Stanley, you have to, well, why did Collins get such a big platform? It wasn't just because of Time magazine or the secular groups, it's because many avowedly Christian groups and pastors like sadly, Tim Keller, whose own denomination actually had views that were completely contrary to Collins' views on creation, they helped platform. I mean, it was Tim Keller who used his prestige to invite people to these private get-togethers to basically only hear one side. And when Keller was invited by Discovery Institute, actually by me personally, to do something similar for people to hear from intelligent design proponents, and I actually had a Christian foundation that he respected ready to fund it, Keller begged off.